Hey guys, it's Bethany with ABQ Creations, and today I'm going to show you how to make the mitten for your smitten. Because it uses the crocheted knit stitch, aka the waistcoat stitch, it has a thicker fabric which makes it warmer than traditional crochet. These mittens are great by themselves, or you can pair them with a smitten. I have a tutorial on how to create a smitten, which is perfect for Valentine's Day, and I'll link to that down below. A couple of things before we jump into the tutorial. Number one, you will need to make 2 of these mittens. You can wear one on either hand, so you'll use the same pattern for both. 2, the mittens may not end up the same size. If using with the smitten, you might want one to fit a woman with small hands and one to fit a man with large hands, for example. This video will show how to make a woman's size small, but can easily be customized by adding more stitches around the top of the cuff to make a larger size. 3. When I start talking about decreasing the section covering your 4 fingers, you can keep it simple by beginning your decrease on the stitch before both stitch markers, instead of how I do it in the video, which is beginning the decrease before the first marker, but on the second marker. Don't worry, I'll post a reminder before the decreases start. And 4, even if you have smaller hands, you might want more wiggle room for your fingers. That's completely fine, and you can still follow along. Like the larger sizes, just create more single crochets on top of the cuff in multiples of 2. Now that we've covered that, here are the supplies you'll need to get started. Yarn. For today's tutorial, I'm using Vanna's Choice in the color Pink Rose. Any size 4 worsted weight yarn should do. I was able to get 2 mittens out of 1 skein of yarn. If you're doing a larger size though, you will definitely need 2 skeins of yarn. A crochet hook. Today I'm using a size K or a 6.5 millimeter size hook. If you crochet tightly, you might want to size up. These are optional, but I would recommend stitch markers if you have trouble finding the beginning and end of your round. A needle for weaving in your ends, and scissors for cutting off your yarn. Let's get started. We're going to start our mitten by working on the cuff. If you'd like to make a longer sleeve, you will add on more chains at the beginning. And if you want to make it wider to fit a larger size hand, you're going to add more rows of ribbing as we go along. So let's get started. For my cuff, I'm going to start with chaining 11 stitches. And I start by weaving in my ends, but you can save it for the end. Once you have 11 stitches, we're going to do a slip stitch into the second chain from our hook. Continue by slip stitching in the remaining 9 stitches across. Once you've slip stitched all the way across and you have 10 stitches, we're going to chain 1, turn our work, and we're going to slip stitch in the back loop only. So as you're looking at the top of your stitch, here's your front loop and here's your back loop, and we're just going to slip stitch into that back loop. We're going to continue by slip stitching in the back loop only all the way across. Make sure you're counting your stitches, as it's easy to lose one at the end of the row. So you always want to make sure that you have 10 slip stitches as you're going across. Chain 1, turn your work, and repeat that row. We're going to repeat that same row until we have 15 ribs on each side, or 30 rows. Again, if you need more or less rows to fit your wrist, you can do so. I'll meet up with you after I have 15 rows on each side. Okay, so once you have your 15 rows of ribbing, which when I say ribbing, I mean the part that's sticking out at you, because that's going to be one row. The second row is actually the hidden row that's on the back, the ribbing that sticks out on the other side. So once you have 15 rows of ribbing on each side, or however many you need to fit around your wrist, and remember it is very stretchy, so 15, it might not seem like a lot, but you should have some good extra stretch there. Now we're going to start joining our cuff together. So for our join, we're going to chain 1, and then we're simply going to piece our cuff together. Now we're going to work in this stitch here in this loop. So if you're looking at the top of it, it won't be this back loop. It won't be way in the front, it'll be this one. Okay, so we're going to insert our hook, and then your original row might be a little tough to see, especially if you weave in your ends like I do at the beginning. But we're just going to go ahead and do a slip stitch all the way across. Okay, so again, we're going to go into this loop, and then we're going to find our stitch. And we're going to do a slip stitch and continue to slip stitch all the way across your cuff. So once you get to the end, you're going to finish off that slip stitch. This is what your cuff is going to look like. There's your seam. Okay, and now we're going to start working up our mitten. For this part, again, if you need to make it larger, my hand, I would be like a size small in gloves. So if you need a bigger size, you're going to want to add on more stitches around your base. And for that, you're going to want to add them on in extras of 2. So I'm going to find 22 stitches and pick them up around the cuff. If you need to make it wider, I would start with 24 or 26 stitches, for example. And make sure that you're crocheting loosely as you single crochet around this cuff, because the way that we work the stitch in, it's really tough to do if you crochet tightly. So make sure that you pay attention to your tension. So basically you're just going to find, you should be at about 11 stitches when you reach the halfway point. It should be a good gauge, but we're going to just pick up 22 stitches or however many you need to. So I'm going to work between and do 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to find one in the V, kind of pick up an extra one. 5. Once you get to the end, we want to do our join, but instead of doing a slip stitch into the first 2 loops like you normally would for single crochet, we're going to do a single crochet into the V. This is what's going to give us the knit look. So insert your hook, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2, just like a regular single crochet, except it's done in the V's. That's what's going to give it this really cool little pattern and keep your stitches nice and even as they work up. So go ahead, we're going to do 2 rounds of this, and we're working in the round. So I'm going to put a stitch marker into my first stitch, just so I can remember where I start and end. And this is where it's important to keep your tension nice and loose. You don't want to tighten down your stitches because it will be hard to work into that V as you come around again. After you've done your row of inserting your 22 stitches or however many you needed, plus 2 additional rows done in the crocheted knit stitch, we're going to start our next row. So what we need to do is we need to increase here. So we're going to, I removed my stitch marker, but in your first stitch you're going to do 2 stitches into your first stitch. Then continue all the way around, and once you get to the final stitch in the round right before the marker, then you're going to increase again. So, and remember, we're working in the round, we're not doing any joins, we're not doing any chains to move up to the next round, we're just continuing to crochet in the round. For our last stitch, we're going to do another increase, and again we're working into the V just as before. So go ahead and do 2 stitches to finish out that round. Now we're going to do 1 round, just doing the knit stitch, doing 1 knit stitch in each stitch. So we did an increase round, we'll do a regular knit stitch, then we'll do another increase round, and then another knit stitch. And we'll come back and I'll show you how to do the next increase round. Coming to our next increase round, we want to put 1 stitch into our first stitch, and then we're going to put 2 stitches into our second stitch. And make sure you keep that marker. Finish doing your stitches all the way around until you get to your second from the last stitch. I'm up to my second to the last stitch, and we're going to go ahead and increase here. So put 2 stitches into the second to the last stitch, and then do 1 in your final stitch. And now we're going to repeat and do just the knit stitch for this round, 1 in each stitch. For our next increase round, we want to do 1 stitch into the first 2 stitches, and then we're going to do 2 stitches into our third stitch. You can start to see where the increase is leading up like this. And then we want to go back and make sure that we mark that first stitch. So when we come around to the other side, it'll be a mirror image of that. So when we get to the third from the last stitch, we're going to put an increase right there. So we'll put 2 stitches in there. I'm up to my third from the last stitch, so I'm going to do my increase. And then stitch into the last 2 stitches. And again, we're just going to do a regular row of single stitches all the way across. And I will put in 1 more increase row in mine. You might need to do more. So if you feel like it'll be too small for you at this point or after this row, then you can continue to increase, do more increase rows. You'll just continue the pattern of moving your increase out by 1 stitch each row, or every other row, because you'll have to do a regular crocheted row in between each increase row. So I'll meet back with you at the start of the next increase row. On to my final round of increases, and again, you might need to do 1 or 2 more of these. I wouldn't do too many more because your thumb size, you don't want to make the thumb hole too big. Again, just work with your hand size. You also want to keep in mind that if you just need it to be bigger in general, then you're going to need to add on more stitches at the beginning when you're working into your cuff. So just keep all of that in mind. Okay, so for my final increase round, I'm going to do a single stitch, into the first 3, and then in the 4th one I'm going to do my increase. Go ahead and finish that round, and you can see how this is starting to form. It's kind of what you should see on the thumb side for now. So when we increase again, we're going to put it into this stitch, which is the 4th from the last stitch. And that's where we'll increase again. So work your way around, and at that stitch, if you need to use an extra marker, go ahead and place it. But just make sure you increase once you get to that point. I've reached my 4th from the last stitch, so I'm going to do my increase. And stitch into the remaining 3 stitches. Now we're going to do 1 round of just the regular knit stitch, 1 knit stitch in each stitch. I'll meet back with you at the marker. Once you finish your row of just doing the crocheted knit stitch all the way around, you should have something that looks like this. At this point in our increase in our project, you want to try on your mitten to see how it feels. And I still have my stitch marker here, so I know that's about the center mark. What we're going to do with this is we're going to try to connect, we're going to connect right about here. So you want to make sure you have enough room in your thumb. You want to make sure it's long enough to come to this point so that you can connect it. Again, if you need to do another row of increase, then you'll go ahead and do that now, and then followed by a single row of just the regular knit stitch. I'm happy with where mine is sitting, so I'm going to start working up the next row, and I'll show you how you do this. If you continue on and do more increases, that's fine. You can just follow along with this step after you've increased however much you'd like. So we're going to continue on just doing another row of just knit stitch without any increases. But I will show you when we come back around what we want to do when we have to start working on our thumb hole. So I'm going to put a marker here. And then I'm going to continue around. When we get to here, I'm going to put a stitch in this first increase stitch here, and then I'm going to actually save these 4 stitches and not crochet in them. So don't crochet in your last 4 stitches. And I'll meet back with you once that's done to show you how we connect it for our thumb hole. Now that I've made it around and I have 4 stitches remaining of this round, I'm going to skip those last 4 stitches, and then I'm also going to skip the first 4 stitches of the next round. And I'm going to do another knit stitch right in the 5th stitch. So what that's going to do is it's going to open up and create this thumb hole here, and then we'll work that up at the end. So now we're just going to focus on going around, and this is where you may want to add another stitch marker just so you know where your initial stitch is. But we're going to continue on, and we're going to work a few rounds, several rounds of just knit stitch, and we're not going to do any increasing and we're not going to do any decreasing. So what we want to do is just keep working in the round and build this up until we have about 1.5 inches left on our hand, and I'll show you how high up. So now here's my thumb hole, and you want to work up till you get to about here on your hand. So continue your rows, and I'll meet back with you once we have enough finished on our glove. I wanted to pop on quickly as I'm coming to the end of my round. I have one more stitch left in this round. And you can see it's going to be hard to work into this stitch, but you can still see where the V is. So you need to make sure that you're working into that V. And then we're going to just simply go over here and start in the first stitch of the next round. So we're going to turn our work. Again, it can get a little putsy, it can get a little tricky to get in there. But you're just going to continue working in the round just like that. So you're going to completely skip over your thumb hole. We'll work on that after we finish the top of our mitten, and we'll come back to it. I just wanted to hop on and show you guys how I'm doing that, and the rest of the round should be much easier to complete. Once your mitten is worked up to this point, you want to start your decrease. Now what you want to do on your last round, when you're crocheting around, you want to stop before you get back to your stitch marker. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to move our stitch marker, and we're going to place another stitch marker on the opposite side. We want to kind of lay our mitten flat, and you can see how our stitches have kind of started to wander over, and that's fine. But what we need to do to counter that is we're going to do our decreases on what appear to be the sides. So you want to find your 2 stitches on your sides, and you can just eyeball it. Once you're laying it flat, you should have a pretty good idea of where the sides are. So I'm going to go off of these 2 stitches, which means I want to place my marker into that first one that I'll come across. And then I'm going to come on this side, and I'm going to go off of those 2 stitches. If you want to count, you can, and make sure you have it exactly halfway. That's fine. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to say this is fine. So I'm going to mark that stitch, the first one, and we're going to get started on decreasing. I wanted to quickly explain the difference in your decreases for the tops of your mittens before I went into how to do it. In the video, I'm going to show you how we end up with this. It actually caused, from the video, it actually caused it to have tighter stitching on one side and more open on the other. So what I want to show you is my second method, and it'll turn out much more even for you. Either method is still fine, so if you follow along with the video, you should be just fine. This one has a cleaner method for decreasing, and I wanted to make sure to show that. So when you're coming around and you're working on your decrease, you'll come to the first stitch marker, and I said you'll have to decrease on the stitch, starting the stitch before your stitch marker, and you're going to decrease over those 2 stitches. I then said in the video, when you get to the other side of your mitten, you want to decrease starting on your stitch marker. To keep your mitten even, ignore that and do the same as you did at the beginning. Start your decrease before you get to the stitch marker. That will help keep it even on both sides. If you have any questions on this, comment in the comment section down below, and I'll be sure to help you out. Coming up to your first stitch marker then, you're going to start your decrease on that stitch. So I'm going to remove my marker, and the first part of our decrease will be on that first stitch. Now when you come back around, you'll have to start your decrease before the marker. But for this first stitch, you do it on the marker. So we're going to go ahead and mark this. And I'm sorry, you'll have a regular row of crochet in between each decrease row. So same thing, we're going to crochet up to our next marker. Again, keeping our tension loose. And once we reach this marker, we're going to do our crochet. We're going to do the decrease, into that stitch and the next stitch. We're back around to the marker, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a regular crochet round into the little V and continue our pattern around. So I'm going to put my marker back into that first stitch now. But don't finish this entire row, because when you come to the last stitch, you're going to do a decrease on the next round from this stitch into that first stitch where your marker is, because of the way it's going to pull. Now on your next marker, you won't have that same issue. So we'll start our decrease on the next one at the stitch marker going into the following stitch. Again, after we do this regular row. You can see the decrease stitch. When I'm working a decrease stitch, I try to move this over and work into both of those stitches. So I don't want to catch it over here. I want to go in and try to push this over a little bit so that I can go kind of under where this bar is. Where that bar is coming out for this top of the stitch, that's where I want my hook to go. So I'm going to put my marker back. So you just have to remember every time you're coming around that for your very first stitch on your thumb side, you're going to decrease as you're coming up to the marker. When you hit the other side, the opposite side, you're going to start your decrease starting with the stitch marker and going into the next stitch. And it's just because of how it pulls the fabric. So now we're back here and we're on our decrease row. So into my last stitch, I'm going to start my decrease. I'm going to pull up that loop and then insert into the next loop, into that next stitch, and we're going to do our decrease. So now I'm back here on the opposite side. Instead of starting before, I'm going to start my decrease in the actual stitch marker. So we're going to continue that pattern all the way around. We're going to do a decrease row, and then we're going to do a regular row, and then we'll do a decrease row and a regular row, and so on, until you have about 10 to 15 stitches remaining. We'll close it up. If you needed to start with more stitches at the beginning, you're going to actually stop when you have quite a few stitches left, and we'll be able to loop it together and cinch it up at the end. I now have about 14 stitches left. They cover my fingers completely, so I'm going to cut off my yarn here and I'm going to stitch it together. So I'm going to show you how I do that. You'll notice that there's no longer an even number of stitches here as there are here. That's okay. It's not going to show up. You can tell it gave it a nice decreased look and still keeps it pretty even. So just know that that's okay. It's not going to hurt the final outcome. So let's cut off our yarn. I'm going to leave a tail so that I can weave in my ends when I'm done. And you don't need a really long tail for this. You're just going to cut about that much. And I'm actually going to end it. I'm going to pull out my yarn, and then I'll show you how I stitch it up. So for closing up the top, you're going to go into that front loop only with your needle on every stitch. And you can tell when you get back to the beginning, it's already started looking like it's curled around a little. So all you need to do now is just pull it tight. And I like to loop through a couple more before I knot it off and tie in my loose ends. That just really secures and closes up that hole. And if you had to add on stitches, if you're making a larger size glove, because like I said, this will fit about a size small for women. So if you need to add more on, add more stitches on at the very beginning after you've made your cuff. Make sure you're putting on in even numbers, you're adding extras on. And you should still be able to use my same tutorial, even if you're making a larger size. Okay, so now we're ready to tie our knot. I'm going to hold off on that though because I want to finish my thumb hole before I flip my glove inside out. So you can just save that part for the end. It'll be fine for now, and then we'll move it to the middle of the glove so that we can really stitch it in and hide that yarn. For our thumb, we won't even need this stitch marker. What we're going to do is we're going to join our yarn. And instead of joining where that first stitch was, I like to join back here because this is where it gets a little bit of a gap anyway. So if you have a little extra yarn in there, it's not going to be a problem. So I'm going to work right into here, and I'll show you what happens. So again, we're just going to work around after we've done our join. This is where I like to tie it off. I usually do a stitch first and then tie it off. And you can either save that for the end to weave it in. I like to weave it in as I go. If it was something like a blanket or something where it gets washed and tugged around more, I'd probably save it for the end. Since it's just a mitten, it'll work this way. So we're going to stitch all the way around. And for this we'll be working in the round as well, so we don't have a join. And when you get to the side, again, it can get a little tricky working into those stitches. We're just going to do it like this. And while I'm working onto the side by the thumb, I actually like to do, it's like I'm building up a stitch, but then I'm decreasing. So I'm not adding or taking away any stitches in the end. But I like to insert my hook down here into that, into that part of my thumb hole, just to close that gap a little bit more. And now we're just going to continue right on with crocheting in the round. That's where we had our join. So we're just going to keep building up. Now if you want, just to know where your beginning stitch is and keep it simple, you can add that marker back in You don't have to, as you'll be moving it a lot and more frequently. So if you can just count your stitches, however many you have, like I said, if you had to do more increases in the beginning, you're going to have a larger size glove and larger size thumb hole, so you might have more stitches than I do. But we're just going to keep working around in the round, and I'll come back once we've built it up enough, and I'll show you how to close off our thumb hole. Once you've worked up 8 rows on your thumb, or more, if you need more stitches, I'll show you how far up this came on me. So you might need more rounds than this, but you can see my thumb, my nail is just sticking out of there, and it decreases pretty quickly, so that's why you don't need to go much higher than that. But you want to at least make it to the top of your thumb. So now on our 9th row, or whatever row you need to be on for this, we're going to start decreasing. And I took out my stitch marker because here's a little tip. I know I started in this stitch, and you can follow that V straight up and you know where your first stitch is. So you don't really even need stitch markers for this pattern, but they can help. So I'm going to start decreasing, and I want to decrease every stitch. So I'm going to work my first decrease over the first 2 stitches, and then I'm going to work another decrease over the next 2 stitches, and the next 2, and so on, until I'm all the way around my mitten. And I just have a single stitch left, so I'll just decrease it into that last stitch of this round and the first stitch of the next round. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to do a slip stitch into this next decrease. I'm going to cut off my yarn, and again, you don't need a long tail to close up this hole. So before we turn it inside out, we need to close off our little thumb hole, and we're going to do just like we did on the top of the mitten. So taking our yarn and starting into this stitch, we're going to go into that front loop only with our needle. We're going to come up from the bottom, and I'm going to loop it through a couple of times before I tie my knot. Okay, and actually I'm going to send You want to make sure that when you're sending it down through the center of the mitten that you aren't stitching into the inside of your mitten right now. And we're going to turn this inside out, at least through to the thumb. And now we have our yarn on the correct side. So once you have it on the inside, you can tie off a knot. And then you're just going to weave in your ends. And I like to do that on the inside of the glove just so it doesn't show on the outside. And if you work your way back and forth 2 or 3 times, it should secure it pretty well for you. Okay, now I'm going to finish sending through the top part of the yarn, and then I'll flip it all the way inside out. And again, be careful, you don't want to stitch the top together from the inside. So you just have to carefully maneuver here. And that's how you make a mitten to match the Smitten. The good thing about this is you can customize each mitten to be a different size, so if your boyfriend wants to wear it, or your husband, or your child, and you want to wear one, you can make your size and then custom fit the other matching mitten to whomever you'd like to walk and wear your Smitten with. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section down below. If you can, please like this video by giving it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you stay up to date on all of my current projects. Thanks. Have a wonderful day.